everybody! Today we are going to talk about two very different fantasy books. First, we have Mort from Discworld, the first death book. And second, we have Vengeance of Hope by P.J. Burman, a book I'm excited to talk about here on the channel because it's the continuation of my self-published reviews, where I'm trying to help out the self-pub community that's been so nice to me by giving authors a little bit of a platform. And this book is going to be some I know a lot of people will be interested in once I describe the premise, and let's go ahead and do that! You are going to get a book spank. Vengeance of Hope is a political-based fantasy with very minimal fantasy elements at play. Really, it's fantasy because it's taking place in a fictitious world. Everything else, not really, like, emphasizing fantasy much. But it has several tropes I know fantasy audiences really like. The antagonist is like a zealot who is just thirsting for power. Love a good zealot antagonist. We have a warrior princess fighting right alongside her soldiers. Really like that trope. I should have included it in my trope tier list video. Another trope tier list video in the future. And there's just a lot of really intelligent political maneuvering going on that makes the world itself feel very alive. No one's making dumb decisions, and that's like the greatest strength a political-based fantasy can have. There are weaknesses here though. P.J. Burman's writing is not the best in terms of prose, especially in some of the battles and more epic moments. I found the language to be bothersomely plain. I really needed something that evoked more emotion from me as a reader, but that was just never truly brought forth in the pages. I also strangely found this book to be kind of difficult to follow. I ended up taking quite a few notes on what characters are doing and why, similar to how I had to do in Malazan, alongside my typical critical review notes. Partially, this is just due to people having similar names, but it's more about the fact that I think this needed more TLC in the second draft, with a focus on communication to the reader. There are also quite a few just heavy exposition dumps about the world that felt unnatural. But getting back into the positives, the weaker side, in my subjective opinion, of political fantasy is when there's just good and bad. Vengeance of Hope focuses more on having an established right and wrong and seeing where people all throughout the moral spectrum are going to fall and land. And that was the most enjoyable element to this story, watching characters really develop in this page count. I was surprised by how much I believed these characters changing pretty rapidly within the pages, and I became invested in the ones I was able to keep track of and care about. I really wish this had received a more proper edit, because it definitely could have condensed some of the more unnecessary gears spinning around, and the language, quite frankly, could have been leveled up to match what I thought was overall a really interesting world and narrative. I guess my final hefty criticism is, with everything I've said, you'd think that Vengeance of Hope has quite a lot to say in terms of themes, and really making the reader think about power, as well as the sacrifice people on the lower end of this world are going to be making here. But it certainly touched on those, but it never had much to say or explored them in a meaningful way that really made me sit back and have to process. Like, I love when a book is able to really like point an angle of a character's ideology, or utilize like someone going too far to make you, the reader, have to like sit and think about moral implications and, you know, the greater forces that reflect in our own world to this fantastical one. And it was attempted, but just not achieved. That being said though, the book clipped right along and I enjoyed it overall. For Vengeance of Hope, I'm feeling a pretty solid 5 out of 10. It has its flaws, but I could see some people certainly holding it higher, especially if they are into that more minimal magic, heavy political side of fantasy that does seem to be more popular right now. Thank you, P.J. Burman, for sending me this. I really enjoyed getting to it. Sorry it took me so long. Now, Discworld.
In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living
I found myself one lonesome recent day where I was suffering from writer's block, wanting to pick up Terry Pratchett. So I went back to one of the best showcasings of death there are out there, and that is Mort. Mort follows the story of Death trying to pick up an apprentice, and pretty objectively rapidly giving him far too much responsibility as he's suffering his own existential crisis. And yeah, it's very fun to immediately see Death suffering an existential crisis about purpose and joy, humanity, and his place in the world. And Mort really balances two different narratives here. You have what's happening over with Death, as well as Mort having a bit of a interest as a young man in a princess, and also a developing relationship with Death's daughter. And Mort starts fumbling things up, and Death is going through his own character arc, and seeing how these two narratives, as they predictably do, end up colliding is probably the greatest strength of Mort, because there are themes that play off each other in terms of experience and what experience can do to you really nicely on both ends of the spectrum here. I'm going to get a bit more into spoilers because this is an older book that has been established for quite some time, but don't worry, I'm not going to like ruin the reading experience if you have not got into it. But Mort ends up possibly breaking reality. And as the ramifications of his actions start becoming more and more uncontrollable, that's where I really start to enjoy the emotional range of Terry Pratchett, because I can simultaneously be feeling stress for this kid who's way in over his head and laughing at just so many of the one-liners that simultaneously are just funny on their own, but lend to some of the greater theming going on. That's how you really know Terry Pratchett's a master of his craft. He can make you laugh, think, develop a character, and move the story with one sentence. My only real heavy criticism here for Mort is it's not the best showcasing of Death's character, in my opinion. That comes with other books like Reaper Man. This one is more about the concept of Death within Discworld, and you certainly get a feeling for his character, but I enjoy the actual presence of Death more so later on in his solo books and even his appearances in other Discworld books as a whole. I also want to say it does take a minute for the plot to kick in for Mort, more than I remembered originally. There's quite a bit of setup for a book this short, and then in the second half the plot kind of kicks into gear, so also prepare for that. Mort moves right along. I know multiple people who have finished this in one sitting despite it being, not the thinnest book ever. And in terms of introducing several reoccurring characters within Discworld, this does a fantastic job. I mean, there's some people who seemed a bit confused by Discworld as a whole. There are separate series that you can kind of start at any point, but characters show up again and again, kind of just incestuously, continually throughout Discworld, and it makes the whole series more rereadable because I actually enjoy Mort more upon a reread than I did first time through because of just a greater understanding of what Discworld is. And I actually want to kind of end this review by making the case that I believe Discworld, and specifically books like Mort, strike a magnificent balance of being really enjoyable for adults and certainly not aimed at kids, but also magnificent reads for children. Maybe not the youngest, but once they have that ability to start critically thinking, I think this series is magnificent at planting ideas that are going to make especially developing minds begin to contemplate morality, their position in the world, and those kind of thoughts I think are really, really important to have kids getting into. Give your children existential crises young. Extraordinarily digestible, wonderful, magnificent, very fantastical, and clearly on a different end of the fantasy spectrum from Vengeance of Hope. It's kind of a fun little clashing here. Overall, I'm giving Mort an 8.5 out of 10. It's not the strongest Discworld book, but it's still great, and I think one of the best entry points right alongside Guards and Small Gods. I know some people want to say Colors of Magic. I just don't love that book as much. It's still good, so not necessarily for me. But let me know what you think of these reviews in the comments down below. This is more just a recommendation of Mort than a review. I know, I'm sorry. I'm a gigantic Discworld biased hack, but read it. And consider reading Vengeance of Hope. I had a good time with this too, and supporting self-pub authors is a great thing to do for the fantasy community. It's how we keep our talent pool developing. Links, of course, to check out these books in the description down below, and like and subscribe if you have not already. Hit the Patreon if you want to support what I do here, and I'm gonna go murder a curry.